Wailing Shadows. Manor, 1701. The village of Eldermire lay silent under moonless night, except for some whimperwinds who sighed about its cobbled lanes and bricked streets. The local citizens talked in hushed voices the screaming at night that came out of some ruins of Grimswood Manor, which lies menacingly atop of hills overlooking the village. For decades, nobody even dared go near the manor after sundown, for fear of the wailing shadow that was said to haunt its crumbling halls. Thomas Gray arrived in Eldermire on a brisk September evening, with the date written in his journal as 5th September 1701. He was a scholar from London who had been interested in the stories of the manor and the eerie cries that the villagers reported hearing. As his carriage rattled through the narrow lanes of the village, he noticed the suspicious stares of the locals, their faces pale and gaunt, as if they too had seen ghosts. He entered the Black Lantern Inn, the sole lodging in the village. The innkeeper, Samuel Vickers, was a stout fellow with a wary look. "Well, sir, you must be that scholar fellow they've been running their mouths about," said Samuel in a low tone. Thomas nodded and laid his satchel upon the counter. "So I am. I have come to record the legends of Grimswood Manor." The manor brought a shadow to Samuel's face. "Stay away from that accursed place, sir. The last man who went up there never came back." Thomas pressed on for more information. By the end of the evening, a few coins and some ale had loosened the story from the innkeeper. The manor had been owned by the Blackwood family, rich landowners who had disappeared mysteriously in 1684. Rumors of betrayal, murder, and dark rituals were the whispers surrounding their disappearance. The haunting began just after. Villagers spoke of a woman in a tattered white gown roaming the halls and cries throughout the night. Some say she was Lady Eleanor Blackwood, betrayed by her husband, and left to rot within the manor's walls. Thomas listened intently, his curiosity piqued. "Has no one investigated these claims?" he asked. Samuel shook his head. "We've sent men before, brave men, but none returned. The manor is cursed, sir. You'd do well to leave it be." But Thomas had not been so easily put off by superstitions. He spent the following day interviewing villagers, piecing out the fragmented tales and muted warnings. Every story had told one gruesome tale of how Grimswood Manor was a land of despair and death. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Thomas headed for the manor the next evening, equipped with a lantern, a journal, and a revolver for protection. The path to the manor was overgrown and treacherous, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around him as he walked. The air grew colder with each step, and an unnatural silence settled over the forest. As he neared the manor, a wind swoop outblasted his lantern. Darkness obscured all he saw. Then he heard it. A faint, wailing sound that sent chills to his bones. His hand lit the lantern again with spasms and moved on toward the looming specter of the manor. The gates of Grimswood Manor creaked eerily in the wind, rusty and ajar. Thomas pushed them open and crossed onto the overgrown grounds. The manor itself was nothing but a ruin, its cracked walls overrun with ivy. Still, it possessed an aura of malevolence that made his heart race. Thomas crept into the manor, floorboards creaking beneath his step. Dust and rot filled the air, with the faint scent of roses remaining, as if the ghost of Lady Eleanor still walked those halls. He moved along the grand staircase, where the banisters, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe alive in the flickering light of his lantern, supported him. As he climbed, he felt a chill caress the side of his neck, and the wail grew louder and clearer. It was a woman's voice, ringing with anguish and despair. "Who is there?" Thomas called out into the empty halls. There was no reply, only the noise of his own breathing and the relentless wailing. He pursued the noise to a locked door at the end of a corridor. The door was studded with strange symbols that Thomas had never seen before. With a crowbar from his satchel, He managed to pry open the door and enter a room illuminated by moonlight streaming through a broken window. At the center of the room stood a fancy mirror with its frame blackened and tarnished. When Thomas approached, he saw his reflection, and behind it, the shadowy figure of a woman. She was pale with hollow eyes, and her lips were parted in a silent scream. Before Thomas could react, the figure lunged at the glass, her hands pressing against it as if trying to break free. The room grew icy cold and the lantern flickered wildly. Thomas stumbled back, his journal falling from his grasp. The figure's voice filled the room, a desperate plea for help. "Free me. Save me." Her voice was thin and unmistakable. Thomas's mind was racing. Was that Lady Eleanor? Was the mirror her prison? Cries rose louder, overpowering all other noise. Thomas snatched his journal and ran from the room, his lantern barely lighting the way. Thomas moved down the stairs. He could feel the sensation of something or someone behind him. When finally he did burst out of the manor and into the forest, the wailing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas returned to the inn, his mind racing with what he had seen. He spent the night poring over his notes, sketching the symbols on the door and the mirror. There was something ancient and sinister about them, something that hinted at a dark secret buried within the manor's walls. But the most chilling realization was this: the Wailing Shadow was not just a ghost. It was something far more powerful and far more dangerous. The next morning, Thomas Gray couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clutched his chest. Events of the previous night were replaying in his head like a haunting refrain. He sat down in a small wooden desk in his small room at the Black Lantern Inn, journal wide open before him, but it did not help. The spectral scream, the vision of the tortured face of Lady Eleanor, and that cold stillness which afterwards filled him as he rushed away from the manor. Everything was too sharp for his imagination. He had to come back to the manor, that is, to find out what actually lay behind those phantom cries that haunted the village for years. Still, a part of him dreaded what would await him there. As he looked out the window at the fog that clung to the hills like a shroud, the door creaked open. Innkeeper Samuel Vickers stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light from the hallway. His face, as always, was pale, but now there was a layer of fear in his eyes. "Mr. Gray, you've been up all night," Samuel said, his voice low, almost as though he were trying to avoid being overheard. "You didn't hear it, did you? The wailing." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped the sounds of the previous night were nothing more than a dream, but hearing Samuel mention it confirmed his worst fear, that the cries were real and they had not stopped. "I heard it," said Thomas, his voice tight. "Last night in the manor. There's something inside that mirror, Samuel. Something powerful." Samuel shook his head, taking a step into the room. "I have told you, Mr. Gray, that manor is accursed. The cries you hear aren't just the wind. They are the voices of those who tried to uncover its secrets and failed. There's more than just the spirit of Lady Eleanor trapped in that place. Many souls have been lost there." Thomas stood up abruptly, his journal still open in front of him. "I have to know more. The truth, whatever it is, must come to light. I'm not afraid." Samuel's expression grew darker. "You should be," he muttered. But before Thomas could respond, the innkeeper turned and left, closing the door behind him with a finality that left an unsettling silence in the room. The sun had dipped lower in the sky as Thomas made his way back to Grimswood Manor, a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. The village was unnervingly quiet, as if even the birds had abandoned their songs. His lantern flickered as the wind whispered through the trees, but it wasn't the breeze that unsettled him. It was the sense of being watched. By the time he arrived at the manor, the fog had grown thick enough to obscure the path ahead. The grand gates loomed before him, now completely rusted, barely clinging to their hinges. The manor itself, dark and imposing against the gray sky, seemed to loom taller than it had before, as though it had grown in stature with each passing night. The eerie wail rose from the depths of the manor, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Thomas hesitated, but only for a moment. His curiosity pushed him forward, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he entered through the gate and walked toward the manor. As he reached the threshold, he felt an overwhelming cold, and the cries grew louder, more desperate, more filled with sorrow. This was no longer the distant wail of a ghost. It was a plea for help. Inside, it had been just as he had left it, shadow darkness shrouding him. His lantern cast long, eerie shadows across the decaying walls. Each creak of the floorboards beneath his feet jolted with fear through his body. Still he continued, attracted by the wailing and the undeniable pull of mystery for him that waited within those walls. Thomas walked back to the mirror room, the room where he first saw, in shadow, the figure of Lady Eleanor. But walking down this hallway, something seemed different today. The air was closer, as if something, within the manner of his last visit, changed. He got to the door and found it a bit open. Strange marks in the shape of that character etched into its back seemed now to glow softly as an eerie light shone dimly upon the eyes locked on her as darkness swallowed her whole. And then the image shifted once more. Thomas fell backward, his heart thudding against his chest. He was no longer in the room with the mirror. He was standing outside in the cold, the manor now fully engulfed in darkness. The wailing had returned, louder and more furious than before. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and from the depths of the manor came a force, a cold, malevolent energy that seemed to be pulling him back toward the mirror. He ran, but the wind was a deafening scream that pushed him on and back into the dark manor. And as he was hurled toward the door, a soft voice whispered against his ear, "Help me. Free me." It was Lady Eleanor's voice, but this time it was no supplication. This was an order. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its cold, silvery light over the village of Eldermire. It seemed to light up the fog, which seemed to have come to life and creep along the streets like a serpent, winding around the houses and suffocating the air. The once peaceful village now seemed to be a place lost to time, as if the past had wrapped its tendrils around it, holding it captive in a world that no longer seemed to care. Thomas Gray walked through the streets, his thoughts consumed by the events of the past few days. This haunting in the mirror bothered him. Lady Eleanor's anguished plea for help, Lord Edmund's sinister figure, and this feeling that something dark and ancient had been awakened in Grimswood Manor. He could not shake the feeling that his very presence in the village had stirred up something long buried, waiting for the right moment to rise again. But it was not just the manor that troubled him. The village itself felt wrong. Its people were quieter, more withdrawn, as if they too sensed the impending doom that seemed to hover over them. Even Samuel Vickers, the innkeeper, had become more distant, his eyes constantly darting toward the door, as though expecting something or someone to enter. Thomas had spent the past hours trying to understand what he had found in Grimswood Manor, an ancient tome whose pages were yellowed with old age. The language was unfamiliar, and the symbols inscribed within it appeared to resonate with a dark energy. As he pored over the words, he began to understand that the book was no ordinary tome. It was a grimoire, a guide to summoning and controlling the very forces of the underworld. But it was more than that. It was a key that could unlock the gates of hell itself. The realization hit him like a chill. The Blackwood family had been under a curse, but not the usual haunting. It was the aftermath of a ritual gone completely wrong, a ritual that called forth something far worse than a ghost. Lady Eleanor was trapped in the mirror, her soul bound to the glass, but so was Edmund. The darkness that had sunk in across the manor. This was only the beginning. Thomas knew he had to get back to the manor. There was no leaving now. The curse had been unleashed, and the only way to stop it would be finding a way to sever the connection between the mirror and the forces it had unleashed. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he was not alone in his quest. The village, the people, even the very air around him seemed to be watching him, waiting for him to make his move. They knew what he had discovered, and they were not pleased. As Thomas walked back to Grimswood Manor, the wind picked up and howled through the trees and rattled the windows of the houses as he passed. The fog seemed to grow thicker with every step he took, as if it were alive, breathing with him, pressing in from all sides. The manor loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the darkened sky. It stood there like a sleeping beast, waiting to launch its next snare. He moved toward the gates and found them open, just as they had been the last time he had visited. The air was heavy with decay, and the once great estate now seemed so much a forgotten relic of a time long past. The way to the manor was overrun. The weeds and vines curl around stone steps like they are trying to take it for themselves. The mansion is silent, and all the windows are dark and lifeless, but Thomas knew better. Silence is not peace, just the calm before the storm. He entered the foyer and stopped. The temperature had plunged, the air turning icy as he moved through the darkened halls. The mirrors on the walls seemed to watch him, their surfaces reflecting his every move. But there was something off about them, something unnatural. The shadows danced, swirling in ways that didn't belong. He could almost hear whispers, low, indistinct voices that beckoned him deeper into the manor. With each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, and soon it wasn't just the whispers filling his mind, but visions. Images of a time when things were much brighter. Images of a brighter time with the Blackwoods, with Lady Eleanor and Lord Edmund laughing in the gardens, with the fire that had consumed everything they'd built. But with each successive vision, they became darker and twisted. He saw Eleanor by the mirror, her hands upon the glass, her face distorted in pain. He saw Edmund's eyes, black as coal, watching her from the darkness. And then, it stopped whispering. The silence that came was stifling, pushing in at him from all sides. It was then that he heard it. The soft scrape of something dragging itself across the floor behind him. He turned quickly, but nothing was there. It was just shadows, deep and dark, clinging to the corners of the room. Still, the feeling of dread hung there, growing heavier by the second. Thomas walked into the room with the mirror, his heart thudding in his chest. When he reached the door, the temperature dropped once more, and there was a strange static filling the air, as if the very atmosphere charged itself with dark energy. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The mirror was as he had left it, tall, ornate, and framed in dark wood, with a cracked and age-worn surface. But somehow, something was different. The air around it crackled with power, the whispers that had been whispering to him earlier distinct, sharp, as if this mirror were speaking to him. "Free me." It was his voice, but his blood was cold. It was Lady Eleanor's voice, but it was no longer a plea. It was a command, demanding him to act. He stepped closer to the mirror, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch the glass. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the room seemed to shift. The walls distorted, bending and warping, and the once grand manor around him faded into a dark, oppressive void. And then he wasn't in the room with the mirror anymore. He stood elsewhere, in a place not here at all. An endless space of swirling shadows, the air thrumming with malevolent power. A figure emerged out of the darkness, the face hidden in the shadows, but the presence unmistakable. It was Edmund Blackwood. "You should have stayed away, Thomas Gray," Edmund's voice echoed, cold and distant. "You've come too far, and now there's no turning back." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. "What have you done? What is this place?" "This," Edmund replied with a twisted smile, "is the threshold. The place between life and death. The place where souls are trapped for eternity. And now, you are one of us. As Edmund's form loomed closer, Thomas felt the crushing pressure closing in on him. The shadows twisted and writhed like living things, coiling around his legs, pulling him deeper into the darkness. His breath came in short gasps, and he struggled to break free, but the more he fought, the tighter the shadows gripped him. "You cannot escape," Edmund's voice came again, softer now, almost a whisper. "The curse is upon you. It has already claimed so many before you, and it will claim you as well." "No!" Thomas shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "I won't let you do this. I'll find a way to stop you." The shadows laughed, a low, haunting sound that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the void. "You think you can stop this? The curse has already awakened. There is no stopping it now. The ritual has been set in motion, and you—" Edmund's words were silenced by the darkness that around them began to twist as if answering to some hidden force. The air grew charged with energy, and beneath Thomas's feet, the ground started shaking and trembling. Shadows receded, swirling away like a storm dissipating, leaving Thomas standing in the dark emptiness alone. The heavy silence of the void hung around Thomas like an oppressive cloud, pressing on his chest, and it became difficult to breathe. He expected that the darkness was going to engulf him, draw him down into the depths of despair, but what transpired afterwards was much worse than anything he could ever have conjured in his imagination. The shadows that had once surrounded him began to shift, coiling like snakes in the periphery of his vision, pulling at him with an almost malicious intent. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart, unraveling before his eyes. He tried to move, his legs trembling beneath him as he tried to find solid ground. The more he struggled, the tighter the shadows seemed to squeeze in on him. But there was something else, something far worse lurking in the corner of his mind, a presence awakened by his coming. He felt it, creeping inside, wrapping around his thoughts like some dark vine, twisting and pulling at his sanity. The curse wasn't just on the manor, it was on him now. "You're mine, Thomas Gray," a voice whispered, the words like ice scraping against his skin. It was Edmund's voice, but it felt distorted, as though it had been stretched and warped by the darkness that now surrounded them. "You cannot escape. You are bound to the Blackwood curse now, just like all the others who have come before you." The ground beneath him seemed to shift again, and Thomas felt himself falling, tumbling into the abyss. His mind raced as he tried to grasp at something, anything, to hold on to, but the void was endless. There was no up or down, no direction to follow. It was as if time itself had stopped, leaving him trapped in a moment that would stretch on forever. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the past filling his ears, the words of which he could hardly understand, but so full of anguish that they made his skin crawl. And then suddenly, the world around him seemed to collapse into nothing. Thomas woke up with a start, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps as he shot up from the floor. He throbbed, his head heavy, weighed down by some invisible force. His surroundings didn't feel familiar, though the oppressive dark of the void was replaced by a cold, gray stone room. It pulsed with unnatural energy. Symbols like ancient hieroglyphs covered the walls, their meaning lost to time, but the power they contained still palpable in the air. Slowly, he came to his feet, his legs unsure under him as he looked about. It was some sort of room, although it was not a place at all like he had ever encountered. The stone floor gleamed wet, slippery with a substance he did not understand, and the air was rich with the scent of dampness and rot. And of all these, the thing which held him riveted was the figure at the room's center end. It was a woman, her back to him, her long dark hair flowing like a river of midnight silk. Her figure was pale, almost ghostly, and she seemed to be standing in front of a large stone altar, the surface of which was covered in strange markings. "Is that Lady Eleanor?" Thomas whispered, his voice hoarse, as if the words had been ripped from his throat. She slowly turned around, her face full of shadow, but her eyes lit up with an unnatural and ghostly light. Her mouth opened wide, but no word emerged from it. Instead, a cold wind swept into the room, carrying with it the scent of death and decay. "Help me," she whispered at last, her voice barely audible, a faint tremor of desperation threading through it. "You have to break the curse. You must free me." Thomas moved 1 foot ahead of him, his heart beating fast within. The room closed around him, and the walls were like some tangible force closing in, contracting space around him. Thomas was racing through his thoughts. He didn't know what it was, nor why he'd brought to this place, but what had brought him to Lady Eleanor. "You don't understand," she continued, her voice growing more frantic. "The curse is not just of the manor. It is of the bloodline. Edmund made a terrible mistake. A deal with forces beyond our control. A bargain with the darkest entities that exist. And now you must pay the price." Thomas could feel the weight of her words set down upon him like an unspoken anvil. The curse was not just a haunting. It was something much worse. Something that came in a line from the Blackwood bloodline. Now, apparently, it had him as well. "Tell me how to stop it," Thomas said urgently, his voice sharp. "I must stop it before it eats everything alive." There was something like fear flickering in the dark of Lady Eleanor's eyes, but deep abiding sorrow sat there too. "You cannot stop it, Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the deafening silence that had fallen over the room. "The curse. It has already begun. The ritual has been set in motion, and there is no going back." The shadows in the room shifted, growing darker, twisting around the altar like a living thing. The air became heavy with an oppressive energy, and Thomas could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting, dormant for centuries, to be unleashed. "You are too late," said Lady Eleanor, her voice tremulous with resignation and fear. "The mirror is the final piece. Once it is done, once that mirror breaks, there will be no undoing of the curse." It grew darker, and Thomas felt a chill in the air. He could see his breath fog up in front of him, and he knew the temperature was dropping. Shadows moved, reaching for him, stretching, and pulling at his limbs like some nightmare was trying to pull him in. "No!" Thomas shouted, shaking off the shadows that clung to him like a heavy shroud. "It cannot end like this. I will find a way. I will destroy it." Lady Eleanor's face distorted in pain. Too late. It has already begun. The air thickened with despair as Thomas struggled to hold on to his resolve. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the pressure building to an unbearable level. His mind was reeling, his thoughts a blur of fear, confusion, and determination. He had to find a way to break the curse, to free himself from this nightmare. He suddenly comprehends some unspeakably terrible thing as the darkness closes in around him. Physical darkness, it is merely. The curse itself has the form of the darkness. Every step he takes to avoid is one that only seems to deepen him into the very well within heart of the darkness. The room around him began to distort again, the walls shifting and warping as if alive, reacting to the terror that had taken hold of him. The air crackled with malevolent energy, and he could hear the whispers once more, growing louder, more insistent, as if the voices tried to drown him in their endless, mind-numbing drone. But then, in the mayhem, something caught his attention. A faint glow, barely perceptible at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. He turned toward it, desperate for any sign of hope, any way out of the suffocating darkness. There was that mirror in the corner of the room, a mirror from Blackwood Manor. The mirror held captive Lady Eleanor, where the cursed surface had bound her soul to it. But it was different now. The cracks in the glass had spread, and the surface shimmered with an unnatural light. The mirror pulsed as though it had a life of its own, a dark, malevolent life that had been waiting for this moment. Thomas knew, with the sinking feeling in his chest, that this was the final step. The mirror was the key to everything: the curse, the darkness, the nightmare that consumed him and the village. And now, he had to face it. The cold that clung to the air was unbearable. It was as if the chamber walls themselves had conspired against Thomas, embracing him with their unyielding grip of terror. His heart thudded against his chest, beating like drums in a funeral procession to his ears. The mirror in front of him seemed to shimmer with its cracked surface, but its power was undeniable. The light it threw out was not a soft glow. Rather, it was an unnatural, diseased-looking illumination that caused the air to contort around it and made the room seem to breathe. Thomas was stiff, his breath barely drawing air. All of him cried to turn away, run from there, but he was too smart for that. All his knowledge told him there wasn't anywhere else to go, so he only had one option: down the center path that led straight into the middle of the curse. His legs were as though made of stone, but slowly, against all reason, he started moving in the direction of the mirror. Shadows haunted him for a long time. At every step, it was as if those shadows were stirring like snakes, reaching with dark tentacles and claws, trying to drag him down into the chasm. He could feel their chill grasp on his skin, but did not let himself fall under the dark influence. He had progressed this far. He was not about to allow darkness to conquer him now. Coming toward the mirror, he finally hears a new sound. The whispers resume in an almost deafening, chaotic voice, filling the entire place with its horrible, maddening cries. Not mere ghosts, but voices of every imprisoned soul inside the manor resounding. Thomas could hear them tormented their cries, pleas to escape. They were all bound to this damned place, and now they called to him for salvation, or for his damnation. He stretched out, his fingers vibrating in the air above the broken glass. It was cold to his touch, colder than anything he had ever felt. The instant his skin made contact with the surface, a bolt of energy coursed through his body. His mind split in two, and for an instant he saw everything. It was a whirlwind collision of past, present, and future images, a dizzying kaleidoscope of Edmund Blackwood, Lady Eleanor, and the many countless souls who walked his road. Yet one image towered over the rest, a figure, shrouded, faceless, and masked behind a crimson hood. Its eyes had a bright, unnatural light to them, and Thomas heard its laughter echo through his mind, as cold and hollow as the grave. "No!" Thomas shouted, yanking his hand away from the mirror. It was too late. The curse had begun to sprout in him now, and the final step of the ritual was complete. The room around him began to shift and distort, the walls cracking open like a giant's maw. The floor split beneath his feet, and the mirror's reflection warped into something far darker, far more sinister. The figure behind the mask stepped forward, its presence suffocating the air with an overwhelming sense of malice. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure spoke in a low, guttural growl. "You were never supposed to find the truth. You were never supposed to shatter the cycle." Thomas's knees buckled and he crumpled to the floor, his hands flat on the cold stone as he sought to anchor himself. The darkness seemed to close in on him from all sides, but in that moment, he realized something. The shadowy figure wasn't just an enemy. It was the true source of the curse, the malevolent force that had manipulated everything from the very beginning. It was the one who had started the pact with the ancient, forbidden beings. The man that had bound the soul of Lady Eleanor to the manor. Ed stepped forward slowly, deliberately, and Thomas's heart leapt in his chest as he realized the terrible truth. It was Edmund Blackwood. "You thought I was gone?" Edmund's voice resounded through the chamber, cold and sneering. "But you see, I have never really left. I have always been here, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the next fool to come along, to try and break the curse, so that I can finish what I started." Thomas's mind was in shock from the weight of Edmund's words. Edmund had started it all. His greed and desire for immortality led to the pact that had doomed the Blackwood bloodline. But there was something more, something Thomas couldn't grasp in his mind. Edmund became something other, something beyond human, thriving in the darkness. "You've always been a pawn, Thomas." Edmund continued his conversation, his voice dripping with scorn. "A pawn, a mere tool in the greater scheme of things. Never did you stand a chance of winning. Never did you have the opportunity to break the curse." With a sudden movement, Edmund reached out, and the shadows snapped alive to swirl around Thomas like some living fog. They wrapped themselves around his arms, his legs, pulling him toward the mirror with a strength he could not resist. His body jerked against their hold, but the shadows held him fast, and the agony was unbearable. Every inch of his body screamed for release, but it was as if the darkness was feeding on his pain, growing stronger with each passing moment. The mirror in front of him changed. Cracks that once marred its surface healed slowly at first, and then quickly, as if something ancient and malevolent was being raised from it. The crimson mask that had been just a reflection began to form and solidify in the glass, until the figure within was as real as Thomas himself. The mask twisted, grotesque, with eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You see, Thomas," Edmund's voice echoed, becoming more hollow and distant. "The curse was never about death. It was about control. It was about power over the souls of the living and the dead. The Blackwood legacy was always meant to be a gateway, an opening to something far darker. And you, Thomas Gray, were always meant to be the final piece." The shadows pushed Thomas forward, pulling him into the mirror. But just as his body felt their grip, something inside of him snapped. Raw, desperate energy flooded his veins. With a cry, he broke free from the shadows. He tossed his hand forward and smashed it against the mirror's surface with all his might. The glass shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces, each piece reflecting a different version of Thomas's terrified face. The shards flew through the air like jagged daggers, embedding themselves into the walls, into the floor, and even into Thomas's skin. And yet, in that chaos, a terrible silence fell over the room, as if the universe itself stopped to watch. And in that silence, something shifted. The figure behind the mask, Edmund, or whatever he had become, let out a howl of rage, a sound that reverberated through the walls of the manor. The shadows around Thomas writhed in agony, as if the breaking of the mirror had released them from their prison. The power that had held them captive for so long began to dissipate, and for the first time since Thomas had set foot in Blackwood Manor, he felt the curse weakening. It was over. But even as the darkness began to recede, Thomas knew that this was not the end. The power that had once been contained within the mirror was now free, and it would seek another vessel, another soul to consume. The curse may have been broken, but the shadows would never truly vanish. They would always be waiting, lurking in the corners of the world, waiting for the next fool to come along. The room seemed to crumble about him as Thomas stumbled back from the wreckage of the mirror. The ancient stones of Blackwood Manor were coming apart in a chaotic, maddening cascade of dust and debris. Yet he knew something as he stumbled backward. He had survived. He had broken the curse. And though the shadows would always be there, waiting just beyond the periphery of light, he had proven that even the darkest forces could be defeated.